They thought a single signature could wipe me out of the history books, so they removed my name and lit the fuel that would burn their legacy to ash. I'm Mara Ellis, and for 10 years I poured my life into Asterian labs, late nights coding architecture no one understood, negotiating impossible partnerships, building the product that finally put us on the map. I loved that company like a child. I believed in it. And I believed in the man who once called me his right hand, Rowan Voss, the charismatic CEO who could charm investors with a single sentence and fire people with one sharper. Rowan had handpicked me from a grad program, mentored me into a leadership role, and watched me turn prototypes into profit. For a while, our relationship looked like the dream, mentor and protege, a golden duo against the world. But every dream has its fracture line. As Asterian swelled into an industry giant, Rowan's hunger grew. He started to cut corners, publicity stunts that overpromised, partnerships that skirted ethics. When my cautious voice raised alarms, he smiled and called it hesitation. When I pushed for transparency, he called it disloyalty. The praise I once earned became a liability in his eyes. Quietly, he reshaped narratives, press releases that credited him, board presentations where my diagrams were his bullet points, patent filings that tucked my contributions into vague language and then omitted me from inventor lists. The world around us glittered, glass towers, glossy interviews, conference stages with our logo like a halo. To outsiders, Asterian was invincible. To insiders, it was a house of mirrors where truth reflected only what Rowan wanted seen. He built a circle of smiling faces who nodded whenever he needed an ally, people who learned to applaud loudly and ask questions softly. I tried to play the long game, keep my head down, protect the work, wait for the right moment to speak. But the moment came anyway, in the form of a legal filing I saw with my own eyes, Rowan's name on a controlling amendment that restructured ownership and stripped certain founders and contributors of recognition. My role, my designs, my patents, my title was being quietly erased. When I confronted him, he tilted his head, the old warmth gone. "Business is consolidation, Mara," he said. "Sometimes you have to let things fade so the brand can survive." His voice was clinical, and for the first time I saw the calculation behind the charm. He thought removing my name would dissolve me. He was wrong. That night, as the city hummed below the penthouse where he celebrated his cleanup, I sat in the dark and listened to the silence where my name used to be. The kind of anger that does not shout, but plans had already begun to unfurl inside me. They had tried to erase me. They had not imagined how loud a ghost could be. At first, the signs were small enough to ignore, little slivers of wrongness that I convinced myself were accidents. But when you've poured your blood into something, you notice when the stains start vanishing. My name disappeared from internal documents. At first, it was a missing credit on a draft presentation. Then it was a research paper Asterian submitted to an industry journal, where Rowan's name stood bold while mine was demoted to a vague team contribution. I asked about it once, lightly, in front of a few colleagues. Rowan laughed, arm draped casually over his chair. "Clerical error. You know how publishing is," he said. The room chuckled with him. I smiled too, though inside my chest felt hollow. Then came the favoritism. Rowan began leaning heavily on Lena, a recent hire with the right pedigree and a smile sharp enough to cut glass. She echoed everything he said, nodded like it was scripture, and somehow always had a seat at the table while I was increasingly invited to focus on the technical side. A polite exile disguised as trust. When investors visited, Rowan made sure Lena gave the briefings, using my slides, my models, my strategies. She'd glance at me sometimes, just long enough to remind me she knew whose work she was stealing. But it wasn't just the omission. It was the lies. Rowan began rewriting history in casual conversation. "Remember when I pushed for that risky AI partnership?" he'd say at meetings, weaving tales where his gambles had birthed success. I'd open my mouth to correct him, only to find his eyes already locked on mine, daring me to contradict him in front of the team. I stayed silent, teeth grinding so hard I tasted blood. The toll crept in quietly. Sleepless nights. Meals skipped. That sick, restless energy that comes from knowing something is off but not being able to prove it, like hearing a clock tick in a room where there is no clock. Friends outside the company noticed. "You look thinner," one said gently. "Is work okay?" I brushed it off. How could I explain that I was watching myself vanish in real time, like ink dissolving in water? The breaking point came late one night when I stayed behind to finish a model. As I left the office, I walked past Rowan's private conference room. The glass walls were dark, but the light inside was dimly lit. He sat with Lena and 2 board members, speaking in low voices. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard one sentence crystal clear: "Mara's contributions are overblown. She'll fade out, and no one will remember she was here." I froze. My stomach turned cold. It wasn't a clerical error. It wasn't oversight. It was deliberate. As their laughter echoed faintly through the glass, I stood in the hallway, shadowed and silent. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just being pushed aside. I was being erased, systematically, piece by piece. And in that moment, I knew, the worst was yet to come. The unraveling came with the force of a knife to the back, not swift, but deliberate, twisted slowly until I could no longer breathe. It happened at the annual shareholders' meeting, the one event I had spent months preparing for. I had built the financial models, drafted the projections, and written every word of the proposal that would secure Asteriant's next 5 years. My work. My late nights. My sacrifices. When the lights dimmed and Rowan walked to the stage, I felt the strange mix of pride and anticipation that comes when your creation is about to be shown to the world. But as the first slide appeared, my heart stopped. The title bore Rowan's name. The credits listed Lena as lead strategist. And me? There was nothing. No acknowledgement. No mention. It was as if my fingerprints had been scrubbed clean from the company I had helped build. I sat frozen, every nerve screaming as Rowan smiled confidently, presenting my words as his. The audience leaned forward, impressed by his vision. Investors clapped at the data I had bled for. And Lena, oh, Lena, she fielded questions with a rehearsed poise, like she had lived inside my head while I worked, stealing not just the numbers but the very cadence of my thoughts. When the applause thundered at the end, Rowan bowed slightly, drinking in the admiration. Then he said it, the words that shattered me: "This success is the result of Lena's brilliance and the unwavering faith of this board. Together, we've proven that innovation thrives when the right people are at the helm." The right people. Not me. Never me. I couldn't breathe. My chest ached as though someone had pressed a weight onto my ribs. I excused myself, stumbling into the empty corridor outside. My reflection stared back from a glass panel, pale, hollow-eyed, trembling. And in that moment, it hit me, they hadn't just cut me out of one meeting. They had cut me out of history. Over the following weeks, the betrayal deepened. Press releases painted Rowan as the visionary. Lena's face appeared in magazines as the company's bright star. I searched for my name, for some shred of credit, but it was gone. Vanished. Investors stopped looping me into calls. Clients I had courted personally now wrote to Lena. My inbox grew emptier, my relevance shrinking with every passing day. And then came the financial blow. My shares, once my anchor, were quietly diluted through a maneuver Rowan engineered. He framed it as restructuring, but I knew what it meant. My stake, my future, was stripped away, leaving me with scraps while he consolidated control. I sat in my apartment that night, staring at the documents. Shock gave way to anger. Anger crumbled into heartbreak. And finally, disbelief curled into something darker, the realization that the people I had trusted most hadn't just betrayed me. They had buried me alive, convinced no one would ever dig me out. But as the night stretched into dawn, a question burned inside me, one that refused to be silenced. Would I let them erase me? Or would I rise from the shadows they cast and make sure the world never forgot my name? 4 days, I drifted like a ghost. My apartment was littered with half-eaten takeout containers and crumpled notes I couldn't bring myself to read. Every time I scrolled through the news, I saw Rowan's smug face splashed across headlines, Lena smiling beside him like she'd always belonged there. My pulse spiked, my throat tightened, and despair threatened to drag me under again. But then came the trigger, the moment that turned my grief into fire. It was late one evening when my phone buzzed. A former colleague, Daniel, someone who had quietly admired my work, messaged me. His words were cautious but sharp. I thought you'd want to see this. Attached was an internal memo. My memo. The original draft I had written months earlier, complete with my formatting, my notes, my signature at the bottom. But at the top, in a newer version sent to the board, Rowan's name replaced mine. Every trace of me had been deliberately edited out. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was erasure, orchestrated and precise. The despair that had chained me broke apart, replaced by a steady, simmering rage. For the first time in weeks, my mind cleared. I wasn't powerless, I had evidence. Proof that I had been cut out. Proof that Rowan and Lena had stolen not just my work but my future. I stood, pacing the room. My reflection in the dark window no longer looked hollow, it looked fierce. My heartbeat steadied, not with panic but with resolve. That night, I filled page after page in a notebook, dates, meetings, conversations, digital files, every detail I could remember. I mapped out how Rowan had climbed higher using my ladder, how Lena had tightened the ropes around me. And as the pattern emerged, so did the strategy. It wasn't enough to prove them wrong in whispers. I needed to dismantle them in the open. To make the world see what they had done. To make their names fade into the background while mine blazed forward, unforgettable. The transformation began subtly. I started running again at dawn, reclaiming the discipline I'd abandoned. I reconnected with contacts outside the company, people who still respected me, who trusted my voice. I researched relentlessly, learning not just business strategy but how corruption gets exposed, how legacies collapse under the weight of their own lies. Every small action became fuel. Every breath of exhaustion became strength. The grief that had once paralyzed me now sharpened into focus. By the end of the week, I sat at my desk, hands steady, eyes locked on the notebook filled with my plan. For the first time since Rowan's betrayal, I smiled, not with joy, but with certainty. They thought they had erased me. But in silence, in shadows, I had begun to write myself back into the story. And this time, the ending would be mine. I treated revenge like engineering, cold, layered, and impossible to ignore. If Rowan had erased me with paperwork and polished PR, then I would rebuild everything he'd taken file by file, witness by witness, until his name had nowhere left to stand. I drew the plan in a notebook and put it in 3 places: my head, my lawyer's vault, and the small encrypted drive Malik had hand-carried to my apartment. Step 1: Forensic proof. Malik, an old friend who'd gone into cybersecurity, quietly pulled every archived draft from the company server. He reconstructed revision histories, pulled edit timestamps, and mapped IP addresses. We matched my original models to the slides Rowan presented at the shareholders' meeting. The metadata lined up like a confession. I also dug through patent submissions and found versions I'd authored, complete with my handwriting in margin notes, evidence Rowan hadn't thought to remove. every clerical error became a smoking gun. Step 2. Legal leverage. I hired Noor, an intellectual property attorney with a reputation for forcing boardrooms to sweat. Noor explained the leverage: a priority claim on patents, a motion to compel disclosure of board communications, and a demand for an immediate accounting of stock reallocation. If Rowan had consolidated control by legal trickery, we could use legal machinery to freeze those maneuvers long enough for the public to see what he'd done. Step 3. Witnesses. Power corrodes loyalty, but it doesn't fully erase conscience. Daniel, who'd once admired my work, agreed to testify that I authored the proposals. Elena, a quietly influential former trustee who'd grown uneasy with Rowan's consolidations, offered to confirm the back-channel conversations that quieted dissent. Even Lena's assistant, tired of passing on falsified talking points, handed me calendars that showed who attended which drafting sessions. Each human voice turned raw data into a human story. This was not accidental, it was theft. Step 4. The traps. Arrogance is predictable. Rowan loved the spotlight at investor demos. He'd take anything that looked like a shortcut to praise. I arranged a low-key technical briefing that I would miss on purpose. I seeded a plausible investor lead that would tempt him to reuse my model's live. Malik would record the presentation feed, Noor would have the legal freeze letter queued to send the moment the intellectual property challenge was filed. The moment Rowan used my material in public, it would be recorded, time-stamped, and undeniable. Step 5. Sequencing the strike. Timing mattered: legal freeze, board packet, press brief. Noor would file the IP claim and the injunction, Elena would demand a special audit, Daniel would provide sworn testimony, Malik's metadata would go to the board's counsel, and Priya, the investigative reporter I trusted, would drop the first public piece only when the legal scaffolding made burial impossible. No single outlet could be bullied. No single ally could be bribed back into silence. All the while, Rowan smiled on stage, accepting accolades and posting glossy photos with Lena. He was safe in plain sight, and that made him dangerous, but also predictable. On the night before we moved, I sat with the dossier spread on my kitchen table: notarized copies, server logs, patent drafts, witness affidavits. My hand hovered over my phone. I was about to press send to Noor, set the whole sequence in motion, when my phone buzzed. A text popped up from an unknown number: "Don't do this tonight. He's invited the investors here early. Be careful." I looked up. The city outside my window glittered, innocent. Inside, my pulse quickened. Rowan still thought he controlled the calendar. Someone else had noticed my plan. And the next 24 hours would decide whether I exposed him publicly, or whether the circle he'd built would try to smother the truth before it could breathe. The investor lounge glittered with crystal and quiet confidence. Men and women who liked their risks calculated and their winners obvious. Rowan arrived like a monarch, flanked by Lena, smiling for cameras, basking in the warm applause of people who believed his version of the story. He flicked through glossy slides that he thought would seal the next round of funding. He didn't know the boardroom had already been seeded with a different feed. He didn't know the air itself had been rewired against him. Noor's injunction landed in his inbox at 9:02 a.m., elegant and immovable. At 9:05 a.m., Malik's forensic packet, complete with reconstructed drafts and IP timestamps, went to the company counsel and 3 major investors. At 9:07 a.m., Priya dropped the first public hit, a carefully sourced exposé that laid out the timeline of theft, the patent drafts with my handwriting, the board emails that discuss consolidation, and the notarized affidavits from Daniel and Elena. The room's murmur became a question. Rowan tried his old tricks. He rose, voice smooth, to reassure the crowd. He tried to frame Noor's filing as a distraction from Mysterian's mission. But Malik's screen flicked through side-by-side comparisons. My original model, dated and signed, than the slide he was touting as his own, watermarked and timestamped during his live demo. The investors' smiles thinned. Phones lit up around the room as trustees and legal teams read the same packets I had sent. The humiliation was immediate and public. One major investor stood, calm and cold. "We funded a person, not a mirage," she said. "I want a full audit before we commit another dollar." Another hand followed. Commitments that had been spoken into existence only days ago were pulled back in whispers and formal letters. A sponsor called their PR team mid-toast and asked for immediate reassessment. Rowan's empire of influence began to leak, tiny hole by tiny hole, until it could no longer hold. Outside, the press did what it does best: amplify. Clips of Rowan confidently taking credit for the work he hadn't authored played next to scrolls of Malik's metadata and Priya's quotations. The hashtag demanding an independent review climbed within hours. Clients who'd been courted by Rowan now demanded contracts be suspended pending audit. The market smelled blood, projections tightened, the boardroom tightened its jaw. The legal dominoes were merciless. Noor's motion for an immediate injunction on the disputed patents was granted pending hearing. Trustees called an emergency meeting and, faced with sworn testimony and forensic proof, voted to place Rowan on administrative leave. The CEO who'd erased my name was escorted out of the building by security, past the same corridors where I had once worked unseen. His face was not the composed mask of PR. It was raw, small, defeated. I did not cheer as the doors closed behind him. I had not built this for spectacle. I had built it so the truth could stand where lies once reigned. I watched the room recalibrate. Colleagues who had looked the other way now offered apologies that sounded thin but honest. Investors requested meetings with me. Priya hugged me, tears in her eyes, and Daniel nodded like a man relieved to be on the right side of history. Rowan's empire collapsed not with a single dramatic boom, but with the precise, clinical unspooling of evidence. He had tried to erase me; instead, he had written the map of his own ruin. Standing in the conference room now mine by right, I let the quiet settle, clean, absolute, and irreversible. They had tried to erase me. Now the world remembered my name. End with a goosebump-worthy poetic justice line. Finally, break the fourth wall, ask viewers if they've faced betrayal, encourage comments, and invite them to subscribe for more stories.